Welcome to Module 2. In this module, we are going to be looking at the differences between prejudice, stereotypes, beliefs, as well as oppression. And specifically, what we're going to do is keep this at the societal level to try to understand how these function at a societal level, how they get formed, particularly understand the nuances between, and try to have some examples of how they come to play in our conversations. So these particular three dynamics are important to us from the point of view that one of the objectives of this course is to explore how our belief systems as educators, as well as individuals that are part of society, are influenced and affected by different kinds of belief structures. And we're going to talk about how these come into play. And these become important for us from the point of view that we are part of these nested relationships that are connected to both societal level types of frameworks that shape how we see students who are defined as different. And unfortunately, and as well as fortunately, it's a two-edged sword. Those belief structures shape the way we act and engage with our students in contexts like schools. So consequently, we want to begin to inventory these and understand how these come into play and how they affect what we do. So we are going to do some definitional work to make sure that we understand the nuances between these three constructs, and importantly, tie those to belief structures and how those belief structures shape what we do. Equally, we need some examples. And examples are the second part of this module, and these become important because we need societal examples to grab onto. Discrimination, stereotypes, and prejudice are ubiquitous in society. Many of us are engaged in conversations with family and peers talking about some of the different issues that have emerged in the United States within the last 2 years. The Black Lives Matter conversation, as well as some of the other issues pertaining to drug use and so forth, and the decriminalization of drugs, for example, is going to be important. So we are going to explore some of the societal levels. So we are going to explore some of these different elements that are examples for us, specifically the war on drugs as well as the criminalization of drugs, how that is shaped by stereotypes, discrimination, and become part of an apparatus, a societal apparatus that is about exercising power around these different frameworks. So these examples will give us one entry point. Equally, we want to begin to inventory our own social world. As I stated, we are all social beings that are in these nested relationships that shape how we interact with individuals within our social spaces, at our homes, in our community. Equally, you are institutional actors. We are teachers, we are educators, we are counselors who are engaged with young people who are from different communities. So consequently, we want to make sure as part of this unit, part of this module, that we are able to do some of the inventory work of understanding, A, what are some of the stereotypes as well as discriminatory practices that get enacted in our workplace, but also try to figure out how we might begin to disrupt these. Part of the initiation of this, in terms of exploring your own beliefs as well as thinking about institutional context, is first doing the identification of how did this emerge? How does it emerge? And equally, why do they emerge? What's invested when those become part of our world and our social landscape? We will seek to explore these as part of a way of looking at a documentary that connects these as well as propels you to look at your social world. Let's now move to definitional work. Let's begin to look at some of the differences between prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. And this element of this definitional work is not part of your reading. So we are lecturing this piece as a way of managing the content that you have and making sure that we don't burden you with a lot of reading. So we need to make sure we're working from the same constructs and the same definitional terms. These constructs are going to pop up in other classes, so you want to hold on to these as a way to make sure that you're working from the same definitional terms. So let's start first with prejudice. And look at the definition and begin to think through what is foregrounded in this definition. And what becomes important as we begin to think about prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination are there are elements that are frameworks, and there are elements that are action-driven, where frameworks are tied with action. Prejudice, as is emphasized in this definition, is one of those framework pieces. It has to do with those internal thoughts, feelings, and assumptions. So in identifying these in terms of internal thoughts, what we're looking at are individuals. So this is very much kind of an individualistic dimension to thinking about the way that beliefs, structures function. And so consequently, we want to understand how, or we want to emphasize that these are learned prejudgments. And these prejudgments are very much connected to societal elements, specifically how societal frameworks about other individuals are circulated amongst individuals, may find themselves in different texts, media, and so forth. But fundamentally, when we think about prejudice, that emphasis on the learned as well as the internal thoughts and feelings becomes very important to understanding prejudice. So when we think about individuals who have prejudices, what we are looking at the way that they are making sorting kinds of processes to make decisions about individuals. So where do these come from, right? So when we think about these internal beliefs and internal thoughts, and they're learned, how do we connect these to the societal? Well, the societal dimension is where stereotypes come into play. Stereotypes are those generalizations, and the generalizations circulate widely in society, and they're these rules of thumb that are reductionist in the way that they do inventory work for us as individuals. So we can think about, if you recall from your ethnic studies courses that you have taken probably a few years back, there were conversations about the Asian American and the model minority discourse. And that is a framework or a belief structure that has this very stereotypical set of elements or imagery that has reduced all Asians to particular kinds of proclivities and sensibilities. And the stereotypes are attributed and glossed over all individuals from that group. And so the stereotypes are those facets that become part of that prejudice set of individual belief structures that get employed through actions. Now again, we are talking about framework, so we haven't gotten to the actions piece, right? So, but that idea of the relationship between prejudice and stereotypes feed prejudice. They become these ways in which discriminations become part of people's processes and people's acts. So, again, prejudice is emphasizing those learned prejudgments. Stereotypes, on the other hand, is highlighting the simplifications or those generalizations that are circulated amongst different kinds of mechanisms. And again, we want to think about these stereotypes as not just emerging from individuals, but they also have a text relationship, they also have media relationships that are a way in which they become very social. Third, we want to talk about discrimination. This is the acting upon these different kinds of prejudices. Individuals engage in actions, be they very subtle, very tacit, or very, very overt. Violence. Gun violence is one of those examples that many times is enacted as a discriminatory act. And it is done on the basis of prejudices. And so consequently, we can think about discrimination as being very, very overt in that fashion, or it may be the case that it might be a microaggression, which is this very subtle yet very tacit action in which individuals are treated differentially. And that differential treatment can be dismissive. So those three pieces are some of the important ways in which we need to make differentiations between prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. So we have frameworks as well as actions that are part of the prejudice, stereotype, and discrimination triad. We need to begin to locate the facets of power and oppression as part of this. Your readings for this particular module pick up power and oppression as key conversation points. And I just want to bolster a few of the elements that are part of that discussion. And specifically, I want to start with first power. And the reason we're talking about power is because, as I said, in this module, we are looking at the societal as well as our individual beliefs as part of these societal relationships. The next module, we will pick up that institutional school organizational facets, but we have to understand how power is part of this societal set of relations, specifically how institutions function in terms of giving these actions the brunt of the force. And there's two ways we want to think about power here. And they become both are very important, and they need to be seen as integrated with each other, but they're important from the point of view that they help us understand how institutional, organizational, governmental dimensions come to take those actions and give them a type of force that moves beyond just the individual. Individual actors are important. Equally, we need to understand how social institutions are also part of that power dynamic. So let's start first of all with structural facets of power. There are structural ways of thinking about power in terms of material mechanisms. So in the Sensoy and D'Angelo piece, for example, they talked about structural power, and specifically they give you the example of how the mechanism and process of denying women the ability to vote was a way in which power was exercised by males as a way of keeping their voice and their sense of agency oppressed. So it was a way in which they were denied engagement in the process. This is a clear example of a structural power mechanism. And these material mechanisms can be seen in different types of ways. They function through mechanisms like voting structures, and they also function through other force structures that are within society. Police departments, for example, use force. They're aligned with different kinds of symbolic mechanisms that we call the law. And these pieces are part of the structural relationships that link individuals and society. They link individuals as well as institutions to be able to create and enact this power. The second piece that we want to locate in terms of thinking of power is what we call ideological and discursive power. And for those of you who are theory folks, you probably remember the conversations or readings that you had regarding Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault gives us a way of thinking about discursive power, which is looking at those framing systems. So this is what we call discursive systems. And discourse and discursive apparatuses are going to pop up as a constant conversation in your conversations in this course as well as throughout the rest of the courses. But what becomes important about understanding discursive power as well as ideological power, we're talking about those frameworks. They too get tied to the structural dimensions, but they are principally looking at the systems of rationality. In other words, the language organization of how objects are constructed through language and other symbols, social symbols. So as an example, I identified the way in which the denial of women's opportunity to vote represented a structural example of power. The mechanism that drove that was a discursive system or discursive framing relationship that worked to construct women as unable to think rationally and to make these kinds of judgments. So you had this social discursive system that was a set of symbolic meanings that constructed women as other or different than men. And this discursive system could be found at both the individual belief level of men, but equally was also pervasive in other texts, science texts. So for example, if we take a look at medical texts of the time, women were partitioned as very different than men in terms of their mental processes. You saw the same kind of processes at the level of different kinds of social texts for constructing African American. We can identify a similar type of process of discursive construction for African Americans as well as other ethnic groups in the United States. This way of constructing objects, people, groups is part of that discursive power. Once they get caught up and connected to structural mechanisms like voting processes, through the eligibility to work in particular kinds of professions, or equally the ability to own property, say, they become part of what that ideological discursive couplet. And that's the ideological is where they become part of the structural. So you need a bridge between the social symbolic systems, or those discursive dimensions, and the structural domains. And that bridge is once these beliefs become part of ideology. So people act upon these particular discursive frameworks. So let me ask a question here now. What's the difference between discursive frameworks and stereotypes? Are they the same? Are they the different? What do you think? Well, if we are able to follow this, here's where we have a connective piece between Senso and D'Angelo, as well as someone like Foucault, who would say, well, stereotypes are in many respects part of a discursive system. They function as a way to create these frameworks of otherness. And these frameworks are seen as truths, or what is defined as regimes of truth. And so we need to understand, and part of the trick for us as social beings is trying to understand when particular regimes of truth find their way into our frameworks. There are these different frameworks that circulate within society, and they take a very truthful, or I should say they have a very truthful status in our frameworks. And so we want to begin to understand how those are come into play. Let's now move to oppression. And we've now, just as to recap as a summary, power has two different dimensions in which it functions. The structural piece as well as the second piece is the ideological discursive. The next piece we need to connect here is oppression. So oppression is that set of forces that individuals experience. So oppression can manifest itself as both a set of structural arrangements, like denying individuals the ability to vote, brutality, police brutality. Equally, it could be denial of employment opportunities. The other piece of oppression can take place is the way that individuals are constructed. So that discursive piece. So as an example of that is if we think about the way that LGBTQ individuals were constructed during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, by social workers as well as the DSM. The DSM constructed their sexual preferences as an illness. And that particular social construction can also be seen as an oppressive dimension. So the ideological discursive piece is one piece that can be oppressive. Equally, they can get harnessed and catapulted by structural relationships. So oppression has different ways in which they can come to play. Equally, we need to understand that the oppression can also be intersectional. So what I mean by intersectional is that oppression can take place across multiple axes of our identity. So as an example, if you are a black lesbian woman in American society, you may find that the structural oppressive dimensions that you experience in your everyday life are not only predicated upon your race, but can be interwoven by your race as well as your sexual preferences. So the complexity of how oppression takes place is never unidimensional. It has these multiple, very complex intertwining facets that we see within society. So let's now transition to looking at some case studies and examples. And it becomes important that we do this at a societal level, again, because we want to make sure that we're able to understand how these dimensions of prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination function, and understand at a societal level how those shape our belief structures and how those come into play.
Okay, starting in this particular slide, we're going to look at the aspect of individual beliefs and social framing. And with that, we're going to briefly take a look at kind of the individual and societal beliefs and how they ultimately frame our individuals' views on issues associated with race, gender, class, and subsequent aspects of discrimination, prejudice, and eventually down the road, oppression. And they're just very specific in terms of what these look like. And I think Sensoy and D'Angelo did a very good job in giving us the example of the eyeglasses. With the eyeglasses, we have two key pieces. The frames themselves keep the lenses in place, and then the lenses through which we look as an individual. And to start off this particular piece, we're going to look at kind of that individual piece, and that being the lenses through which the wearer of a set of glasses ultimately looks through and has an individual view of interactions with society. And those interactions are ultimately going to inform that particular individual. Right? And so therefore that creates that very micro experience of that individual's interactions with different elements of American society, whether it be a gay man, or African American, a first generation immigrant, maybe just arriving from the Middle East. However that interaction takes place between the individual and those particular actors will inform how that individual kind of creates an understanding of these particular groups of people, whether it be a gay man, whether it be a Middle Eastern immigrant from war-torn Syria. That's a very individual and specific experience that person is going to have with this particular category of a person. Now that's important in terms of kind of understanding how that kind of comes into play in terms of discrimination and or prejudice. Because we can have a very individual, singular experience with people that may lend itself to some element of prejudice and discrimination, and how we ultimately interpret that particular interaction. From the standpoint of education, this is an important piece in terms of how individuals kind of interact with diverse elements of a school or in American society. And I'll kind of give you two very brief examples. First, this summer I was a participant in the grading of the AP Research exam, which is a new program. It involves students spending an entire year doing a research project and then submitting to the College Board a 15 to 20 page research paper. Now as a grader, they set the system up so that the students, when they uploaded their research papers to the College Board, there was no name. The research papers had no kind of indicator of who the individual was, male or female. Geographically, we had no idea where the research papers came from. We didn't have teachers' names. There was nothing associated with those research papers. And this piece was brought up in the Sensoy and D'Angelo reading regarding employment practices, where some employment practices, they block out the names, so those people who are reviewing a application might not be able to infer anything about the applicant based on their name or maybe even a street address. And so the College Board recognized that ultimately a mere name appearing on a research paper might cloud the judgment, or at least marshal in a set of prejudices about the particular author of the research paper. And as Sensoy and D'Angelo have mentioned, that could be negative and or a positive act of prejudice or discrimination. Example being that if the name on the research paper was clearly or might indicate African American or Eastern European or Asian, that might marshal in a set of prejudices on behalf of the grader. Even regionally, or if you knew where the school was, and if you as a grader knew that that school was in a bad part of a particular city or neighborhood, that might marshal in a set of prejudices. Now bringing that to a very real example, 2 years ago as I was at a training for this particular AP program, we were sitting at round tables and we were looking at specific exemplars of what would be a high paper, medium paper, low paper. And one of the educators seated next to me, as we're kind of going through and discussing, why we'd give it a high rank, medium rank, or low rank, we were looking at a paper that was considered to be an exemplary paper. And the educator next to me leaned over and said, "This obviously was written by an Asian American girl." Now again, these exemplar papers had no names on them. It showed, though, however, that this particular educator was inferring ability, inferring achievement based on how well the particular paper was written, and therefore ascribing it gender and race, in lending itself to a stereotype and clearly a prejudice, perhaps, in that that would ultimately, this individual as a grader, potentially, if they knew if the paper they were grading was from an Asian female in their class or wherever the case may be, they would already be prejudiced towards believing that this was a high-achieving student, and then therefore the grade achieved may be higher than actually the paper itself would indicate. And so there you have two examples right there of kind of the individual piece. Now obviously that brings us to the second part, and that would be the societal piece. And I would argue from that educator that I was seated next to at the training, there were much larger macro pieces that would have ultimately kind of set those lenses in his glasses and have him interpreting his interaction with the world in a particular way. And so when we look back societally, we find also kind of these set of experiences that ultimately, as we move from family, school, church, peer groups, potentially university and even work settings, and the communities in which we're situated, those too have an impact on how we shape and frame our particular beliefs about groups of individuals, again, along lines of race, gender, class, whatever the case may be. And so going back to that example of the individual seated next to me at the AP conference, clearly marshaling in a set of experiences both individually and much larger in terms of, as I think we all understand, the myth of the model minority with Asian students always being high achievers and high performers. That has a much larger societal component to it, in that we find significant research across the board as researchers tend to dispel that particular myth or ultimately look to see if there's any truth to that particular piece. And here we have this educator who clearly was marshaling two pieces of both that framing, that much more macro set of beliefs, as well as the micro individual as he was looking through his particular lens, looking at that particular research paper. Then moving on to how these two pieces, the individual as well as societal framing, can lead to kind of a coalescence of the two different pieces and ultimately finding itself into systems of oppression. Now it's very important to state, before we kind of get into the two examples I'm going to use for this piece, is that we have to understand that oppression in most circumstances, especially when we talk about large-scale systemic oppression, was unintentional, in that no political actor sat down with the direct intent to oppress certain groups of people. It's a direct result of individual views in connection with those larger contextual or societal views that allowed for these particular events to take place, and ultimately policies to be instituted that then became systems of oppression. I'm going to use the war on crime and the war on drugs, dating back to the Nixon administration all the way up to and through every subsequent administration since Nixon. Brief history there. Nixon was the very first president to make crime a national public policy issue. Up until Nixon, there was no national law enforcement policy coming from the White House. It was pretty much left at local level, state and local level agencies. It mainly was a direct response to increasing rates of heroin addiction, specifically young men coming back from Vietnam, and the administration realizing quite quickly that they had a hand, they and the Johnson administration prior to that, had a hand in this addiction because they had sent young American men over to Vietnam. While there, they became addicted. They came back with the addiction. Ultimately, it spread, and so they saw increasing rates of drug use across the United States, specifically associated with heroin. Now, let's fast forward that to basically the 1980s, and the shift to basically getting tough on crime and what we commonly refer to these days as the war on drugs. In that, it became very easy by the 1980s to start developing policies that were, in the view of many politicians on both sides of the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans alike, in fact, it was quite universal in its support, to really ratchet up the criminal penalties associated with drugs, whether it be the possession of, the distribution, or sale of those drugs. The idea there in Washington and in capitals across the United States was to ramp up the level of penalties associated with these particular activities and drugs, believing that it would ultimately decrease drug use. What it did was that we see the coalescence of two particular beliefs. One, the individual belief that we as individuals, seeing the impact of illicit drugs and illegal drugs on individuals that we knew. In some circumstances, seeing those people responsible might be of one race or of one gender or of one class of people, therefore informing us into a set of beliefs that these individuals who are involved in either one, drug use, or in terms of drug distribution and sale, ultimately hold particular characteristics: lower socioeconomic, male, and quite potentially African American, Latino, whatever the case may be. That then fed into a larger societal understanding of this problem of drugs and a set of societal beliefs that ultimately its behavior needed to be punished and needed to be punished harshly in order to end its particular practice. And the larger held societal beliefs being that ultimately these the major venues for this type of activity would be larger urban areas. You're not going to have small towns in Kansas in the 1980s too concerned about a crack cocaine epidemic. And so what happens is these larger belief systems come into play with the individual ones, ultimately allowing for the creation of policies that become so substantially harmful to society at large that even in a modern context, now as we talk about prison reform in the United States, there were a set of unintended consequences as a result of this get tough on crime and specifically the war on drugs, in that what happened was we started filling prisons. And we started filling prisons specifically with young African American males and young Latino males. But then by the latter part of the 1990s, even young white males and young white women were finding their way into prisons. Had several impacts. One, the cost on American society. Building prisons became a cash cow for many private organizations. But what it was also doing was creating these prisons at the cost of taxpayers. The second impact there was an undeniable racial characteristic to the vast majority of people who were in prison on nonviolent offenses that was being associated with drug possession or drug distribution. And then you add to that another layer, and most of these individuals, and this is where we see the prison system basically kind of transcending race, most of the individuals were also from lower socioeconomic areas. And especially in the latter parts of the 1990s and in the early new millennium, with the advent of and popularity of crystal meth and then cheap heroin, it's now gotten to the point where most people recognize that what seemed like a good policy, that being in the 1980s, to really ratchet down, became a system of oppression in terms of targeting a particular group, unintentionally targeting. Nobody sat in Washington and said, we're going to basically take care of these urban dwellers. It was a policy that was seen as being an effective policy. Ultimately, though, became a system of oppression as both individual and societal beliefs came to support that particular component of a legal system that was going to punish what we now start to see, especially with users of drugs, punishing a particular medical issue in some circumstances, and ultimately becoming a system of oppression. The next example is one that is ongoing. We look at prescription drugs versus illicit drugs. This too has its root back to the war on drugs, but this is much more associated with the clear divisions between class and the individuals who have the financial ability to have health insurance, and therefore with most health insurance programs, you get prescription drug insurance. You have access to a doctor, obviously with a copay, and it might not be great health insurance, but regardless, you're still going to have access to doctors, and therefore pharmacists and prescription drugs that are approved by the federal government for use by individuals under the direction of a physician. Juxtapose that against individuals who don't have the money available for health insurance. those individuals, so one, they have no access to doctors, so a doctor is not going to be able to prescribe any medications to them. Therefore, without the doctor and the prescription, they're not going to be able to go to a pharmacy. And so you have two groups of individuals, those with insurance and those without. We all understand that that dividing line is an economic line in terms of the cost of health care in the United States. So if we take an individual, a young woman who's in a car accident, she's upper middle class, white upper middle class, doesn't really matter. She gets in a car accident, she gets medical services, and then the doctor is able to prescribe her pain medications. And let's just set aside the kind of horror stories we hear these days about that young individual then getting addicted to the pain meds. Let's just assume that the pain meds serve their purpose for that young woman. And they go on to basically enjoy life from that particular point on. Juxtapose that against a similar female who's in a car accident with no health insurance, has no access whatsoever to any type of health care, racks up insurmountable bills at an ER for the medical services that that individual received. The only recourse for pain medication is going to be illicit or street-level drugs because they can't access a pharmaceutical system that ultimately is only accessible through health care or health insurance. And so what we find is we've created a two-tier system unintentionally in that one, an individual who has money and has access is going to be able to access all of the medical services available to keep them ultimately within the boundaries of the law. Those individuals who don't have the financial resources available to them, they're going to find themselves moving outside the law in order to acquire the type of meds necessary to deal with the pain that they're in. Now, as a result of that, the individual who is moving outside the law to acquire the drugs necessary to deal with their medical condition and the pain management, that individual is now identified as a criminal and can very easily find itself in the same scenario as mentioned in our first example with the Get Tough on Crime and the War on Drugs movement. And that individual is very clearly going to find themselves potentially in the criminal justice system in one way, shape, or form, whether it's buying illicit drugs on the street corner or fabricating a prescription, engaging in prescription fraud to get the drugs necessary to deal with the pain that they might be experiencing. As a result, we've created once again another oppressive system in terms of one, individually, we as individuals create understanding of what the legal system should look like. And therefore, we don't want to have illegal drugs available. We want people to work within the confines of the legal system. All right? And while we might be able to empathize with individuals that we come in contact with, the larger implication in a legal system that looks to punish people who can't operate within a framework that's established by the very legal system, we in essence find individuals being oppressed by a legal system and, in some circumstances, a healthcare system, and forces them into a realm of criminality in order to acquire the particular meds necessary. And it's not intentional, but clearly we find that a vast majority of those people, one, are under the in a lower socioeconomic status, and therefore they tend to be of racial minorities, specifically in urban areas, but also clearly we find many of them being outside the realm of the middle class. And so those are just kind of two examples. Again, we all have very clear empathy for an individual through our individual views, or not empathy, depending on how our interaction with individuals goes. That, in conjunction with larger societal belief systems, ultimately can result in very clear systems of oppression that no one ever intended to occur. For our next slide, we're going to move into an example, a timely example, of how these individual and society beliefs can work together to create a system, once again, that can be, in some circumstances, oppressive. And if you're not familiar with it, we're going to use the events in New York City, 1989, in which a young white woman was running through Central Park in the evening, was brutally assaulted and raped. And that event set off a firestorm, one, in terms of holding law enforcement accountable, understanding that New York City in the 1980s was simmering with tensions along racial lines. New York City was still reeling from almost 2 decades of high levels of criminal activity, drug use, as well as the crack cocaine epidemic at a particular time. So the city itself was rather rife with crime. Central Park, though, was always seen as kind of a safe haven. It was a sort of a demilitarized zone where crime was very rare. And so a young woman was assaulted and raped, and in the process, law enforcement picked up a large number of young African-American boys who were in the park at the time. Through subsequent investigation, they narrowed their focus down to 5 young men who ultimately would be prosecuted for the assault and rape. All of them juveniles under the age of 16. And I don't want to give too much away to the documentary, but I just kind of wanted to give you that little piece there. And then kind of moving into the documentary itself, what becomes very troubling is these young men will all ultimately be vindicated after having served, in many cases, up to 7 years in prison, starting in juvenile facilities, and then as you age up, when you turn 18, they move you into adult facilities. And it wasn't just by some miracle that they were released. An individual ultimately pled to the crime, indicating that they had done it. They knew all the details of the crime, and the young men were all exonerated, but yet they were, all but one were out of prison at that particular time. And that information became available in the early part of 2002. Subsequently, the young men sued the city of New York and did, as of last year, win a $63 million judgment. But why the documentary itself is of interest to us is the firestorm that developed outside of the event itself. And you find kind of these individual views on display as the documentarians not only compile historic archived media interviews with the mayor of New York City at the time, Ed Koch, as well as the governor, Mario Cuomo, of New York, and even a current political actor, Donald Trump, taking very active kind of roles and being very active in articulating a particular position in regards to these young men. And then from that we also have, which is now becoming commonplace outside of courthouses in the United States, where there are questions of race and inequity, protests, and on one side of the line you'll have one particular set of political positions, and on the other side another set of different positions on the guilt or innocence of the individual. And it was a highly charged atmosphere. And what again makes it even more troubling is all of these young men ultimately were innocent of that particular crime. And so that leads us kind of into kind of the viewing prompts. What I want you to do as you're watching this is look for how discrimination kind of is revealed through this documentary. And again, we have to be very clear, this can be very unintentional. It's found in the discourse, the way people talk about the boys or talk about the community the boys come from. You'll find even members of their own community are dismayed and might engage in discussions that are quite similar to other members of outsider communities. How prejudice will reveal itself, and the use of power, and that institutional power against these 5 young men. And so just kind of be aware of that. There are provided within the module some guided questions, so as you're kind of watching the video, pieces you want to hone in on. And I just wanted to add real quickly that what I've done is I took what was almost a 2-hour documentary and I edited out considerable pieces, because I don't want, while you might be outraged, I don't want you to get hung up on the particulars of the case itself, you know, whether it be evidence. The trial, for the most part, has been completely removed. The police interrogations, in some circumstances, have been shortened quite significantly, just to give this a little bit more brevity, and so you're not sitting and watching 2 hours of the documentary. And we're specifically focusing again on kind of those individual as well as societal beliefs, and how those ultimately become, in some circumstances, systemic in terms of the discrimination and prejudice, and then how power is wielded in that particular sense. So just be aware of that. It has been edited, it has been cut, but all the pieces that are important and relevant have been kept in there, and the story will still hold together for you. And if interested, you can always get a hold of the full 2-hour documentary. So be sure to observe and take note of both individual and societal beliefs. What do you have in terms of those individuals who might be interviewed by news cameras or interviewed by the documentary itself, as well as larger societal beliefs, because there are some compelling interviews that are given by individuals in the African American community who they themselves hold these very prejudiced views about the young black man. They're in that community, these individuals, but yet they themselves, because of their individual views, have created a set of societal or larger views regarding these young boys. That's not to say that all members of the African American community held that, but it is a very interesting kind of example of even members within the community were questioning the innocence of these young men as they maintained their innocence. And in what ways can the viewer identify kind of societal oppression at work? And again, to be very clear, just like the previous slide, in most cases this is unintentional. It is the feeding into existing societal beliefs by individual experiences and individual perceptions that lends itself ultimately to allowing these larger structures to engage in systems of oppression. And so just kind of be aware of that. And so I would ask that at this point you pause, take a break from the PowerPoint and lecture, move into the module, find the link to the Central Park 5 edited version. Also download, or at least pull up on your on a personal device or a computer, the guided questions, and view the Central Park 5 edited version that we'll come back to. And so once you've finished watching it and kind of worked through the questions themselves, come back to the lecture and we'll begin on this particular piece, unpacking the documentary and kind of discussing the particular pieces we find within the documentary itself. All right, now having had viewed the edited version of the Central Park 5, I'd like you to take a moment to kind of consider the particular question you see here. In what ways can the viewer identify societal oppression at work within the documentary, based on what we've discussed so far in this particular module and the readings, and ultimately kind of how society itself went down a particular road towards the prosecution and conviction of these young men based on a set of individual and societal views of, in this particular circumstances, the young black male, and we can add in there young black lower socioeconomic male as actors in this particular event. Now, obviously, it should be noted that New York law enforcement, as well as the New York City prosecutor's office, is absent in the documentary due to the fact that at the time the documentarians were making the film, the civil suit against New York City was still in the courts. And so we do have to recognize that they are absent in this particular documentary. But that's not necessarily what's at play in this particular for this particular piece and what we're kind of looking at. Again, we can clearly see that there are some missteps by law enforcement, but yet I would caution to say that law enforcement, both the prosecutor's office and the police themselves, are caught up in the very same discourses that were at work, and so they get swept up as much as anyone else in kind of these both individual and societal views of race and class in their decision to move forward and honing in on these 5 young men. So let's unpack the documentary really quickly. And I would add that it might be very fruitful for you within your groups to kind of be able to process this across the individuals that you work with, just to kind of get a sense of their particular take on the documentary and how it presents these key elements. So first, let's take, to kind of unpack this, take a look at the key actors. And you have some major players in this particular piece, from the police and the prosecutors, the journalists and the media, and especially how they played a role in maintaining a particular discourse in view of the young black male. And we also need to look at the African American community that is, in some way, shape, or form, split, and that the interviews illustrate that even members of the African American community kind of shook their heads in kind of a self-reflective manner, in understanding or believing that, well, it didn't surprise them that this would be actions of their own of young men within their own ethnic group, based on their own experiences, given the state of crime in New York City at that particular time. And so that was a very powerful component that we see there. Then you have the larger white community that rightfully so was outraged by the attack. But again, the way that the discourse and understanding of the individual and societal views and the way they nested together, the larger community itself was also swept up in firmly believing that these young men were quite capable of doing what they were being charged with, regardless of their age. And they rightfully so cried out for justice for the victim, but again were caught up in the individual and societal views in terms of driving their own particular positions in the pursuit of the prosecution of the young men. You also have obviously the politicians. And if you're not familiar with New York City during that period, both Mario Cuomo and Ed Koch were widely supported Democratic politicians. Mario Cuomo, the governor, a populist Democrat whose name was touted several times as a presidential candidate, and Ed Koch, who had been a fervent supporter of civil rights and a very powerful advocate for all New Yorkers across the spectrum. Both of them, as we see the interviews, were swept up in a belief that these young men were clearly capable and guilty of the crime at which they had been charged. Koch going so far as to stating that we have to refer to them as the accused as opposed to the guilty, because that's what the law requires, and already making statements to the press, which would go out to the general public, that he clearly assumed that these young men were guilty and clearly capable of doing what they were charged with. And Cuomo, similarly so, made statements alluding to the fact that the young men were clearly guilty. It was just a matter of going through the process of the trial itself. And that was incredibly disheartening for a lot of individuals, especially looking back, that two very powerful supporters of the African American community and of very progressive ideals were swept up in a powerful set of the nesting circumstances around individual and societal beliefs when it came to these young men. And then with that, we have well-known New Yorkers. You may have noticed a young Al Sharpton, who basically rose to prominence during this period of the late 80s and early 90s, and as a powerful voice for the African American community and the perceived and in some circumstances real injustices perpetrated against the African American community across New York, parts of New Jersey, and the East Coast. He was present at many of the protests advocating for the innocence of the young men, and he took up a very powerful position. And then obviously juxtaposed to Sharpton would be Donald Trump, who went so far as to put substantial amount of personal money into full-page articles in New York newspaper publications advocating for the return of the death penalty, and that these young men should be subjected to the death penalty as a result of their crimes. It should be noted that to this day, Donald Trump has made no apologies for the particular position he took. And so we can see kind of how these elements, from law enforcement, the prosecutor's office, to the journalists themselves, get swept up in these these discourses and the perception and beliefs that it was very possible, if not real, that these young men would have committed this particular horrific crime, regardless of the fact that they were 14 and 15 years of age. And so that tends to be a very powerful aspect of understanding how the key actors that we saw in this documentary participated, and in some cases were willing participants in having their individual views shaped by larger societal views, or vice versa. And so it's key to kind of come back to that nesting of beliefs, a term that Ed had used previously in this particular lecture, and seeing how our individual views kind of nest within societal views, and they tend to inform each other and drive a particular set of discriminatory practices or prejudice beliefs. And in some circumstances, we are completely unaware of how those nest together, and those feed into a larger societal and systemic aspect that we see kind of play out within the documentary. And incredibly frightening in the fact that even the African American community itself in New York was willing to go along with the particular narrative that was being framed by the prosecutorial team in this particular circumstance. And finally, kind of the piece that we see there is the existing discourses that were already at work prior to the event itself, leading to a particular practice within the legal system and the community which in the legal system is embedded. And that being that there was no real question on behalf of any of the major actors across the board as to whether or not the young men had committed the particular crime. I mean, even the journalists themselves, in a self-reflective manner, during the documentary, realized that they failed. They failed their due diligence, to quote one of the interviewees, in really digging into the facts of the particular case, and kind of climbed on board with the existing narrative of just how horrific the crime was, and the unquestioned guilt of the young men, because it fit the narrative that had developed over the previous decades in terms of the young black male as predator. It fit, and so the journalists went with it. And we see through the documentary that they, even at that particular point, were somewhat reflective and ashamed of themselves for not really seeing the larger picture and being able to dig past these existing narratives and discourses. And I want to add, just kind of as a final piece to this, another kind of sensational case that played out roughly 15 years ago, if not more, when the Duke lacrosse players were accused of gang raping a stripper at a party, and how quickly the young men were prosecuted in the press. And in this case, we see a kind of direct opposite effect, in that you have young, wealthy, privileged men, attending Duke University as lacrosse players on lacrosse scholarships, and the accusation of a rape, and how quickly even the university itself and the legal system within North Carolina came to basically move very quickly towards the prosecution of the young men based on the statements of the victim, and ultimately leading to the young men losing their scholarships, leaving school, the head coach being removed from his position, in the assumption that it was a systemic issue, character issues regarding the coach and the young men, and ultimately having a pretty substantial impact on their lives. The caveat to that is, obviously, these young men came from families who had the means to hire legal counsel that ultimately could really press the legal system, specifically the prosecutors in Durham, North Carolina, and ultimately revealing that there were false statements made by the victim. And here we see a kind of direct opposite, where while on one hand the discourse and the nesting of a substantial belief that, of course, young privileged white males would completely act in this manner because of their sense of privilege, and the fact that mom and dad could buy them out of any criminal behavior. Clearly, the existence of wealth provided for, in this particular case, the exoneration of everyone involved in these particular accusations. The exact opposite of what occurred for the Central Park Five young men. In both cases, Central Park and Duke Lacrosse, the young men were innocent of the particular accusations. In both cases, we see kind of society in those particular communities kind of getting caught up in a set of beliefs that in New York City, of course, young black men would do a particularly heinous crime like this. And in Durham, North Carolina, it was of no surprise to many people that young white privileged college athletes would, of course, behave in this particular manner and gang rape a woman. But again, we see where class plays out in this, and then on one side, the Central Park Five young men go to prison, and in North Carolina, ultimately the young men are exonerated of the particular crime. And these kind of are incredibly powerful examples. And so we kind of have to move forward in that understanding kind of how we see the Central Park documentary as an example across the board, all the key actors as mentioned, of the way in which the individual views can ultimately be informed or inform these larger societal views. And that from there we see that impacting kind of these institutions, whether it be the juridical or the legal framework and the legal system, like New York City, what happened in New York City, and spreading its tentacles across in the way that the society at large was more than willing to accept the particular narrative regarding the young men in this particular case.